How to add crochet embellishments to clothing. Embellishing with crochet can be a creative way to repair a piece of clothing, and it can add flair to a piece by inserting a neckline or a hem. You will need crochet yarn, a crochet hook, a crochet pattern, an article of knit clothing, sewing pins, a needle and thread, and scissors. Step 1. Crochet the insert. Inserts can vary from a lace neckline to flowers to a simple doily. Step 2. Choose a piece of clothing for the project. Get creative and modify an old sweater with a hole on the sleeve, or spruce up a new dress that is a little too plain. Step 3. Decide where to put the insert on the garment and then pin it in place on the outside of the garment. Sew the insert in place with long, loose stitches, also known as basting, to help hold the insert in place. Step 4. Thread the needle and use tiny whip stitches to secure the insert in place. Did you know in 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, a revolutionary machine that separated cotton fiber from the seeds.
How to broomstick lace crochet. Broomstick lace crochet forms a visually interesting and beautiful stitch. You will need a size K crochet hook, 9 skeins of yarn, and a size 50 knitting needle. Optional, additional skeins of yarn. Step 1. Use the crochet hook to do a slip stitch of the first color and then chain 180. Step 2. Form row 1. Hold the crochet hook with your right hand and the knitting needle with your left. Insert the hook into the loop, pull it up, and place it on the needle. Step 3. Insert the hook into the second chain, yarn over, and pull up a second loop. Place the loop on the needle and repeat this process for the rest of the row until there are 180 loops on the needle. Hold the knitting needle between your knees if you are having difficulty using only your hands. Step 4. Form row 2. Slip off the 5 loops nearest the point of the needle and turn them to the right. Insert the crochet hook through the loops, yarn over, chain 1, and do 5 single crochets. Step 5. Slip off the remaining loops in groups of 5. For each group, turn the loops to the right, insert the hook, yarn over, and do 5 single crochets. Continue until row 2 is completed. Did you know? Carpets are Afghanistan's largest export. In 2005, the country sold $140 million worth of carpets abroad.
How to buy crochet supplies. Learning to crochet won't turn you into your grandmother, but will provide you with a lifelong hobby. You'll need a pattern, yarn, a crochet hook, a ruler or gauge checker, and stitch markers, yarn pieces, or safety pins. Step 1. Buy a pattern or find a free one online. Step 2. Choose your yarn. Consider the color, weight, feel, price, and care instructions. Buy enough to complete your project. A large hook and smooth, bulky yarn are easy for beginners to use and work up faster than smaller materials. Step 3. Choose the right hook size to go with your yarn. If you're not sure, check the pattern. Buy small sizes for lace and sock weight yarns, medium sizes for worsted and sporting weight, and large sizes for chunky weight and for winding strands together. Step 4. Buy a regular ruler or a gauge checker made for yarn projects so you can check your gauge. Step 5. Buy a package of stitch markers if you will need to mark stitches for a pattern, or use extra yarn pieces or safety pins. Did you know? Mathematicians have used crochet to create models that demonstrate the idea of hyperbolic planes in 3-dimensional space.
How to change thread when crocheting. Whether you are changing colors or joining 2 skeins, this method is easy and works well for either single or double crochet stitches. You will need yarn or thread, a crochet hook, scissors, and a yarn needle. Step 1. Pause your crocheting before you run out of the old thread. Leave a tail at least 4 inches long. Join the new thread at the end of a row, unless your pattern calls for a color change in the middle of a row. Step 2. Position the new yarn on top of the last rows of stitches. Step 3. Wrap the new thread behind and over the needle to yarn over. Step 4. Hook the new thread and pull it through the 2 loops on the needle. Step 5. Continue making crochet stitches with the new thread. Step 6. Join the 2 threads with a small knot if the previous method fails. Step 7. Weave in the loose ends across a row with a yarn needle. Did you know a New York art gallery featured giant sculptures of crocheted rope in 2007, and visitors were encouraged to climb over the huge woven structures? How to choose a filet crochet pattern. Don't waste your time or your yarn on the wrong pattern. Thinking ahead to prepare for your crochet project will assure that you pick the design that's right for you. You will need a computer with internet access, crochet hooks, yarn, and a ruler. Step 1. Decide how you want to search for your pattern. Many patterns can be found online for free, and others can be purchased from craft or yarn stores. Step 2. Think about your crochet experience and look for a pattern that matches your skill level. Most patterns are rated as beginner, intermediate, or advanced. Master the chain stitch and the double crochet stitch. These are the stitches most commonly used with filet crochet. Step 3. Learn how schemes are displayed in filet crochet patterns. Typically, empty squares represent open mesh spaces, and a square with an X is used to represent a filled space. Step 4. Understand the most common crochet abbreviations to make reading patterns easier. Consult crochet books or websites to help you interpret abbreviations. Step 5. Crochet a small swatch of approximately 10 by 10 stitches using the crochet gauge given in the pattern. Use the yarn and crochet hook specified in the pattern instructions. Beginners should start crocheting with heavier yarn and smaller patterns. Stitch at least 10 rows to get past beginners' hurdles. Step 6. Check the gauge and measurements of your swatch against the pattern. Make sure that the stitch count is consistent and that the outcome will be the size you want. Adjust your hook to make your stitches match the pattern. Use a smaller hook if you have too few stitches, and a larger hook if you have too many. Step 7. Start your project and check your gauge as you go along to make sure you are staying on track. Feel confident knowing that you're using the right pattern to get the product you want. Did you know in the 1760s, James Hargreaves invented the spinning jenny, a machine that allowed a weaver to spin 8 threads at once, greatly increasing the speed in which yarns were made. How to choose crochet patterns. Crocheting can be complex, right down to the selection of needles and yarn, so consider the best ways to avoid missteps when you look for a pattern. You will need a pattern selection, discrimination, and time. Optional, a computer with internet access. Step 1. Review pattern instructions to ensure you understand them. Step 2. Think simple when you start. Patterns are typically identified according to skill level, beginner, intermediate, or advanced. Step 3. Find a pattern for a baby blanket or shawl. This will make hook selection easier. Because they are unstructured designs, little blankets, scarves, and shawls render the gauge less important. Step 4. Search for patterns that use a large crochet hook. Large hooks are easy to maneuver and to pull through yarn. In America, a B1 is small and an N15 is large. Step 5. Avoid patterns that call for specialty yarns, including eyelash, wispy, and chunky types, whose stitches might not be as easily counted and can lead to frustrating mistakes. Go online to select patterns on one of the many sites tailored to your skill level. Lots of free patterns exist all over the internet. Step 6. Look for patterns called granny squares. Easily finished smaller squares which allow you to go back and make corrections before stitching them all into a full final piece. Did you know the hyperbolic crochet coral reef, an environmental version of the AIDS quilt, is meant to draw attention to how rising temperatures and pollution are destroying the Great Barrier Reef?
How to choose crochet projects. If you know some basic crochet stitches, it may be time to move on to a challenging project. Here are some steps to choosing the right crochet project for you. You will need crochet needles, yarn, and a pattern. Step 1. Pick an easy project that has simple stitches and just a couple of steps from beginning to end if you are a beginner. Step 2. Determine the gauge, or the number of stitches in a square inch. Gauge determines the finished size of a crocheted item. Baby blankets and scarves are more forgiving in gauge, making them good beginner projects. Step 3. Choose yarn if you are a beginner that is light in color or sport weight, since it will be much easier to see your stitches, making it easier to keep up with the pattern. Step 4. Move up to more challenging projects like sweaters and jackets that have to match the correct gauge if you are more advanced. Step 5. Look at the difficulty levels on patterns. Most patterns are rated as beginner, intermediate, and advanced.
Did you know? When Martha Stewart was released from prison in 2005, she was wearing a crocheted poncho made for her by another inmate.
How to choose the right crochet hook. Using the wrong hook can mess up your gauge and ruin your project. Here's how to pick the right crochet hook every time. You will need a crochet pattern, yarn, and a selection of crochet hooks. Optional, a hook gauge. Step 1. Use the hook size recommended in your crochet pattern. Always check your gauge with a swatch. Change to a smaller hook if your stitches are too loose or a larger hook if they are too tight. Step 2. Use a medium hook size such as I for worsted weight yarn, then adjust it to get the right gauge. Lettered hook sizes range from B to L and P to S, with B being the smallest. Letters later in the alphabet mean larger hooks. Step 3. Use the smallest hooks for working with lace weight or a small hook such as size C for fingering weight yarn. Hooks numbered from 000 to 14 are for working with the finest threads. A larger number means a smaller hook. Step 4. Use large hooks such as size N for bulky weight yarns and extra large hooks when using 2 or more yarns together. Step 5. Stick to working with metal hooks if you're a beginner. Later, you can experiment with hooks made of wood or plastic. Did you know? Knitting needles and crochet hooks are not expressly prohibited on airplanes, although they may be confiscated at a security check. How to convert a crochet pattern into a knitting pattern. Converting a pattern takes a little guesswork and a little math, but with practice, you'll be able to make a nice product from whichever pattern you have. You will need a crochet pattern, knitting needles, yarn, and a knit gauge tool. Step 1. Find a knitting gauge that is similar to the crochet gauge specified in the pattern. The number of stitches will be the same, but the number of rows will vary. Gauge 2 rows of knit for every 1 row of crochet. Crochet stitches are usually taller than knit stitches. Step 2. Work a test swatch of about 6 by 6 inches in your chosen gauge to make sure that your project will come out in the right size. Step 3. Use your knit gauge tool to measure the number of stitches in the inner 4 inches of your swatch. Divide the number by 4 and compare to your gauge. Step 4. Adjust your knitting to match your desired dimensions. Use smaller needles if you have too few stitches and larger needles if you have too many. Plan to use about 33% less yarn for knitting than for crocheting. Step 5. Mark the original pattern with your new measurements or make a copy of the crochet pattern and mark it to preserve the original. Step 6. Knit according to your new pattern. Check your gauge as you go along to make sure you are staying on track. Soon you'll have a nice finished product. Did you know? The renowned Victoria and Albert Museum in London boasts a large collection of historical knit items, including a pair of Egyptian socks dating from the 3rd to 5th century and gloves from 16th century Spain.
How to count crochet stitches. Knowing how to count your stitches is a fundamental step in learning to crochet, assuming you want your finished product to be the right size and shape. You will need yarn, a crochet hook, and place markers. Optional, a crochet pattern. Step 1. Examine the last row of stitches. Determine which type of stitch you have by looking at the front and back of the series of loops. Consult the pattern for your project to find out how many stitches you are supposed to have. Step 2. Don't count the loop on the hook. The stitch next to it is the first stitch. Step 3. Count each stitch or loop, moving away from the hook until you get to the end of a row. Keep your work untangled so that the loops are lined up nicely. If it gets twisted, the loops won't look the same, which might mess up your count. Step 4. Count each V-shaped stitch as 1 stitch for foundation chains and single crochet rows. Don't count the knot at the end if you are counting along a foundation chain. Step 5. Count each post or vertical set of stitches as 1 stitch for double crochet rows. Step 6. Place a stitch marker on the first stitch if you are working in a circle or anywhere you may need to increase or decrease. Did you know? Researchers have found that knitting and crocheting can provide health benefits, such as lowering blood pressure and decreasing memory loss.
How to crochet a hat. Crochet hats can be worn year-round and make great gifts. These steps will show you how to crochet a hat. You will need yarn, a crochet hook, and a yarn needle. Step 1. Choose a yarn color for your hat that will show your individual style. Step 2. Leave a long tail and chain 55. The total finished circumference of the hat will be about 18 inches. Revisit basic crochet techniques before you start. Step 3.
Single crochet in the second chain from the hook and each chain across for 54 stitches for the first row. Step 4. Chain 1, turn, and then single crochet in each stitch across for the second row. Step 5. Repeat row 2 until your hat measures about 9 inches from the beginning. Fasten off, leaving a long tail. Step 6. Thread the tail into the needle and then sew in and out along the last row. Pull to gather the top of the hat and knot. Sew the seam, weave in the ends, and enjoy the warmth of your new hat. Did you know? According to a study done by the Craft Yarn Council of America, a majority of crocheters take their project ideas from magazines. To crochet. If you have an itch to stitch, this guide will help you weave your dreams with needles and yarn in no time. You will need a large crochet hook, heavy yarn, and practice. Step 1. Choose a large hook and thick yarn when you first begin. As your skills progress, you can transition to smaller materials. Both the hooks and the string are measured in weight. The heavier they are, the thicker they will be. Step 2. Hold the hook in your dominant hand like you would a pen or pencil, with the point of the hook facing up. Step 3. Wind the yarn over the pinky, under the ring finger, and then over the middle and forefinger of your other hand to easily feed it as you work. Step 4. Start with a slip knot. Make a simple loop and then use the hook to draw the long end of the string through the hole. Step 5. Tighten the knot by pulling both ends, and then repeat by looping the yarn around the hook and pulling it through the loop to complete a basic chain stitch. The first 5 to 10 rows of the chain stitch are often the most difficult, even for a seasoned veteran, so stick with it. Step 6. Poke the hook through a chain stitch, grab the feeder yarn, and pull it through to create 2 loops on your crochet hook. Step 7. Wrap the feeder yarn around the hook and pull it through both loops to complete a single crochet stitch. Step 8. Cut the yarn, pull one end through the last hoop, and tighten the other end before tying the final loose string to the back of the piece. Did you know? The modern art of crochet was developed during the 16th century. To do half double crochet. The half double crochet, often abbreviated as HDC, comes in handy when you need a stitch that is taller than a single crochet stitch but shorter than a double. You will need yarn and a crochet hook. Step 1. Chain 10 or more stitches with your yarn and crochet hook to make a foundation. Leave the last loop on the hook. Step 2. Pull the long end of the yarn behind and over the top of the hook to yarn over. Step 3. Count to the third chain from the hook and insert the hook through that stitch from the front to the back. Step 4. Yarn over and pull the hook and yarn back through the stitch. You should now see 3 loops on the hook. Step 5. Yarn over again, but this time pull the yarn through all 3 loops on the hook. 1 half double crochet stitch is finished. You should now have 1 loop on the hook. Step 6. Yarn over and insert your hook into the next chain. Repeat the procedure and continue to the end of the row. Step 7. Chain 2 at the end of the row and then turn the chain around to the other side. Read your pattern carefully to determine if the chain 2 at the end of the row counts as a stitch. If the pattern doesn't specify, then count it. Step 8. Yarn over and work the first half double crochet of the next row and each row after onto the second stitch from the hook. Did you know? In 2008, the World Reclamation Art Project completely covered an abandoned gas station with knitted, stitched, patched, and crocheted squares to express their concern about dependency on oil.